Royal LePage put out a survey that 1 in 4 Canadians plan to purchase an investment property in the next 5 years. I'm Michael Ouzas. I'm a realtor in the Greater Toronto Area. I'd like to know your thoughts on if you are considering purchasing an investment property in Canada in the next 5 years. And if you ever wanted to book a call to discuss what that option could look like for you, click on that first link in the description down below. And this article is posted on Royal LePage's website, where it says that more than 1 in 4 Canadians plan to purchase an investment property in the next 5 years. 51% of current investors and 23% of non-investors are considering buying an investment property before 2028. Now, it's a pretty lengthy survey and in detail, but this survey highlights actually is a pretty good point form of what exactly is in the survey. So right now, approximately 4.4 million Canadians currently own investment property, and 26 of all Canadians say they are likely to buy an investment property within the next 5 years. Now, 1/3 of Canadian real estate investors own 2 or more properties, and younger investors between the ages of 18 to 34 are more likely to own more than one investment property compared to their older counterparts above age 35. Interestingly, 15% of Canadian residential investors do not own their primary residence, the majority of whom are aged 18 to 34. And I find that extremely interesting, and I'll talk about that in a second. But nearly 1/3 of investors in Canada, 31%, have considered selling one or more of their investment properties due to higher lending rates, which is actually not as high as I had anticipated, but still 30% nonetheless. And 20% of investors in Greater Montreal area said they are likely to sell one or more of their investment properties within the next 2 years. And this percentage is higher in the 24 and 28% for Toronto and Vancouver. Go over to the Royal LePage website to get the full survey details, but I think those point forms are super important to know. One thing I do find with investors is that typically when you buy one property, chances are you might be considering buying another. And that's where it says 32% of current investors own more than one property. The other element that I think is important to note is that 15% of current investors don't actually live in the investment property they own it. And I find this is really interesting. And I think of a market like Toronto, where I do my business in, is that in the city of Toronto, to purchase a property, it is quite expensive compared to other markets in the area. So if you go to the city of Hamilton, you can get a detached home for a similar price as buying a condo in downtown Toronto. That being said, in Hamilton, the rent prices have increased tremendously in the last couple of years. So if you're able to rent downtown Toronto, for example, at a price of maybe $2,500 a month, which is the average for a 1-bedroom, maybe your mortgage cost on a house in Hamilton might be about the same, whereas that same mortgage cost in Toronto might be a little bit more. That being said, you do not have the upside of the equity when it comes to Toronto. And I think that's a super important thing to note, especially these days where there's all different articles that are coming out on how investors are typically losing money month after month compared to the rent that they're able to generate. Now, if we do put that in context and prices going up anywhere between 8 to 12%, depending on the market in Toronto, that $500,000 condo, if that's where you purchased that, could be worth an extra 25 to 30 grand from January till now. And that definitely makes up for more than just the losses each month on a year-to-year basis. If we look at the Greater Toronto Area summary, 64% of investors own one residential investment property, whereas 34% own 2 or more. 47% of investors in the GTA say they are likely to purchase an additional residential investment property in the next 5 years, which is lower than the national average of 51% by about 4% or so, and lower than figures reported in Montreal and Vancouver as well. Now, if we take a look at the investor report, this is in a chart format, so all the same things that was just summarized. And if you look at the Greater Toronto Area, 86% of people own their primary residence, 11% rent their primary residences, and 3% live with family or friends rent-free, 0% preferred not to say, and 14% does not own in general. If we look at how many investment properties that people own, 64% in Toronto own 1, 27% own 2, and 6% own 3 properties, 0% own 4, and 0% own 5 or more properties. Now, I find this interesting, and maybe once you get into these levels of 4 or 5 properties, maybe it just didn't fall into the category of people that were surveyed for the purpose of this survey. I did also find this interesting, that 95% of people over the age of 55 own their primary residence, 88% of people between 35 and 54 own their primary residence, and under 34 years old, 67% own their primary residence. And this is across all regions as a whole. Same thing when it comes to investing, 70% of people over age 55, just under 70% of people for 35 to 54, and 53% 18 to 34. And this is where they get the rest of the data. So where it says, of those who currently own a residential investment property, how likely are you to purchase an additional residential investment property in the next 5 years? I always find these interesting answers where it's very likely, somewhat unlikely, and very unlikely. And then the net for likely is 51%, which they combine the very likely and somewhat likely together. And when it comes to those who do not own a residential investment property, 6% very likely, 16% somewhat likely, which is 23% of likely. Now you can go and check out all the rest of the percentages where it talks about what types of investment properties, and when buying investment property, what are your priorities? This is all depicted in this survey, and there's a lot of good stuff in here, so definitely worth checking out. So it's always interesting to see, once you get the very likely and somewhat likely answers, that it all gets pooled onto a likely standpoint. But nevertheless, those are the data from a Royal LePage survey. Go and check out what exactly is through the whole report, because I find it super interesting. And a survey like this could even just pique someone's interest to maybe consider the process of purchasing an investment property. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts, and drop a comment down below on if that's something that you would be interested in doing in the future. I'm Michael Ouzas. Thanks for watching.